Hello, my name's Sarah. Thank you for joining and welcome. Hope you're all having a lovely start to the week. I know it is the worst timing in the world right now. Lots going on. We're officially in tier four. Whoop! So no going home for Christmas, but I will be continuing these videos throughout as hopefully they are still just a nice chance for some of us to connect together. So I'm in my garden shed, raring to go. So I will be continuing the videos. So we are nearly through A Christmas Carol. Congrats if you have got this far. If you do need to catch up on any videos, they are all on my channel. So I'll be continuing with Christmas Carol. I think I keep guessing, but I'm always so far wrong. So I think today and Wednesday's video, we should be finishing the book. If I do need to add in an extra video this week, I will do, as I'm hoping to finish by Christmas. So then on Christmas Day, I can do a different video for us all. That's the plan. So yes, sending love. Let's try and be merry within this weird year. I can't believe we're already in December and nearly to the end of this ridiculous year. But hopefully 2021 will be the one where all of our dreams come true. Okay, so get yourselves comfortable as always, and I shall get started with the story. Just to give you a heads up where we last left off, we were in the present day with the ghost, and we were basically in the house of Scrooge's nephew. So they're all talking about Scrooge and how miserable he is, but also his nephew was saying, I'm always there for him if he ever changes his mind. So they were all being merry, passing that bottle around and having lovely Christmassy times that we will have again. I hope. Okay, so with in the nephew's house currently. After tea, they had some music, for they were a musical family, and knew what they were about. When they sang a glee or catch, I can assure you, especially Topper, who could growl away in the bass like a good one, and never swell the large veins in his forehead, or get red in the face over it. Scrooge's niece played well upon the harp, and played amongst other tunes a simple little air, a mere nothing you might learn to whistle in 2 minutes, which had been familiar to the child who fetched Scrooge from the boarding school, as he had been reminded of the ghost of Christmas past. When this strain of music sounded, all the things that the ghost had shown him came upon his mind. He softened more and more, and thought that if he could have listened to it often, years ago, he might have cultivated the kindness of life for his own happiness with his own hands, without resorting to the sexton's spade that buried Jacob Marley. But they didn't devote the whole evening to music. After a while they played at forfeits, for it's good to be children sometimes, and never better than a Christmas, when its mighty founder was a child himself. Stop! There was a first game of blindman's buff. Of course there was. And I no more believe that Topper was real blind than I believed his eyes and his boots. My opinion is that it was a done thing between him and Scrooge's nephew, and that the ghost of Christmas present knew it. The way he went after that plump sister in the lace tucker was an outrage on the credulity of human nature, knocking down the fire irons, tumbling over chairs, bumping against the piano, smothering himself among the curtains. Wherever she went, there he went. He always knew where the plump sister was. He wouldn't catch anybody else. If you'd fallen up against him, as so many of them did, on purpose, he would have made a feint and endeavouring to seize you, which would have been an affront to your understanding, and would instantly have sidled off in the direction of the sister. She often cried out that it wasn't fair, and it really was not. But when at last he caught her, when in spite of all her silken rustlings and her rapid flutterings past him, he got her into a corner where there was no escape, then his conduct was the most execrable. For his pretending not to know her, his pretending that it was necessary to touch her headdress, and further to assure himself of her identity by pressing a certain ring upon her finger and a certain chain about her neck, was vile, monstrous. No doubt she told him her opinion of it, when another blind man being in the office, they were so very confidential together behind the curtains. Scrooge's niece was not one of the blind man Buff's party, but was made comfortable in a large chair with a footstool, in a snug corner where the ghost and Scrooge were close beside her. But she joined in the forfeits, and loved her love to admiration, with all the letters of the alphabet. Likewise the game of how, when, and where, she was very great, and the secret joy of Scrooge's nephew beat her sisters hollow, though they were sharp girls too, as Topper could have told you. There might have been 20 people there, young and old, but they all played, and so did Scrooge, for wholly forgetting in the interest he had in what was going on, that his voice made no sound in their ears. He sometimes came out with his guess quite loud, and very often guessed quite right too, for the sharpest needle best Whitechapel warranted not to cut in the eye was not sharper than Scrooge, blunt as he was it in his head to be. The ghost was greatly pleased to find him in this mood, and looked upon him with such favour, that he begged like a boy to be allowed to stay until the guest departed. But this spirit said it could not be done. Here's a new game, said Scrooge. 1/2 hour, spirit only one. It was a game called Yes and No, where Scrooge's nephew had to think of something, and the rest must find out what he was thinking of by only answering to the questions yes or no, as the case was. The brisk fire of questioning to which he was exposed elucidated him that he was thinking of an animal, a live animal, rather disagreeable animal, a savage animal, an animal that growled and grunted sometimes, and talked sometimes, and lived in London, and walked about the streets, and wasn't made a show of, and wasn't led by anybody, and didn't live in a menagerie, and was never killed in a market, and was not a horse, or an ass, or a cow, or a bull, or a tiger, or a dog, or a pig, or a cat, or a bear. At every fresh question that was put to him, this nephew burst into fresh roar of laughter, and it was so inexpressibly tickled that he was obliged to get up off the sofa and stamp. At last, the sister, falling into a similar state, cried out, "I found it! I know what it is, Fred! I know what it is!" "What is it?" cried Fred. "It's your Uncle Scrooge!" Which it certainly was. Admiration was the universal sentiment, though some objected that the reply to "Is it a bear?" ought to have been yes, inasmuch as an answer in the negative was sufficient to have diverted their thoughts from Mr. Scrooge, supposing they had any tendency that way. "He has given us plenty of merriment, I'm sure," said Fred, "and it would be ungrateful not to drink to his health. Here is a glass of mulled wine ready at our hand at the moment, and I dare say, Uncle Scrooge." "Well, Uncle Scrooge," they cried. "A Merry Christmas and a Happy New Year to the old man wherever he is," said Scrooge's nephew. "He wouldn't take it from me, but may have had it nevertheless, Uncle Scrooge." Uncle Scrooge became so happy and light of heart that he would have pledged the unconscious company in return, and thanked them with an inaudible speech, if the ghost had given time. But the whole scene passed off the breath of the last word spoken by his nephew, and he and the spirit were again upon their travels. Much they saw and far they went, and many homes they visited, but always with a happy end. The spirit stuck beside the sick beds, and they were cheerful on foreign lands, and they were close at home by struggling men, and they were patient in their greater hope by poverty, and it was rich. In some hospital and jail, in misery every refuge, where vain men in his little brief authority had not made fast the door, and barred the spirit out, he left his blessing and taught Scrooge his precepts. It was a long night, if it were only a night, but Scrooge had his doubts of this because the Christmas holidays appeared to be condensed into the space of time as they passed together. It was strange, too, that while Scrooge remained unaltered in his outward form, The ghost grew older, clearly older. Scrooge had observed this change, but never spoke of it, until they left the children's 12th night party, when, looking at the spirit as they stood together in an open space, he noticed that his hair was very grey. "Are spirits' lives so short?" asked the Scrooge. "My life upon this globe is very brief," replied the ghost. "It ends tonight." "Tonight!" cried Scrooge. "Tonight at midnight, hark! The time is drawing near." For chimes were ringing 3/4 past 11 at that moment. "Forgive me if I am not justified in what I ask," said Scrooge, looking intently at the spirit's robe, "but I see something strange and not belonging to yourself, protruding from your skirts. Is it a foot or a claw?" "It might be a claw, for the flesh there is upon it," was the spirit's sorrowful reply. "Look here." From the foldings of its robe it brought 2 children, wretched, abject, frightful, hideous, miserable. They knelt down at his feet and clung to the outside of its garment. "Oh, man, look here, look down, look here!" exclaimed the ghost. There were a boy and a girl, yellow, meagre, ragged, scowling, wolfish, but prostrate, too, in their humility, where grateful youth should have filled their features out, and touched them with its freshest tints. A stale and shriveled hand, like that of age, had pinched and twisted them, and pulled them to shreds. Where angels might have sat enthroned, devils lurked and glared out menacing. No change, no degradation, no perversion of humanity in any menacing. No change, no degradation, no perversion of humanity in any grade, though all the mysteries of a wonderful creation had monsters half so horrible and dread. Scrooge sat back appalled, having them shown to him in this way. He tried to say they were fine children, but the words choked themselves rather than be parties to such a lie of such an enormous magnitude. "Spirit, are they yours?" Scrooge could say no more. "They are man's," said the spirit, looking down upon them, "and they cling to me, appealing from their fathers. This boy is ignorance, this girl is want. Beware them both, and all of their degree, but most of all beware this boy. For on his brow I see that written which is doom, unless the writing be erased. Deny it," cried the spirit, stretching out his hand towards the city. "Slander those who tell it ye. Admit for your factious purposes, and make it worse, and bide to the end." "Have they no refuge or resource?" cried the Scrooge. "Are there no prisons?" said the spirit, turning on him for the last time with his own words. "Are there no workhouses?" The bell struck 12. Scrooge looked about him for the ghost and saw it not. As the last strike ceased to vibrate, he remembered the prediction of old Jacob Marley, and lifting up his eyes, beheld a solemn phantom, draped and hooded, coming like a mist along the ground towards him. Okay, I'm going to start the last chapter. So this is Stave 4, The Last of the Spirits. The phantom slowly, gravely, silently approached. When it came near him, Scrooge bent down upon his knee, for in the very air through which this spirit moved, it seemed to scatter gloom and misery. It was shrouded in a deep black garment, which concealed its head, its face, its form, and left nothing of its visible save one outstretched hand. But for this it would have been difficult to detach its figure from the night, and separate it from the darkness which was surrounded. He felt that it was tall, stately when it came beside him, and that its mysterious presence filled him with solemn dread. He knew no more, for the spirit neither spoke nor moved. "I am the presence of the ghost of Christmas yet to come," said Scrooge. The spirit answered not, but pointed onward with its hand. "You are about to show me shadows of the things that have not happened, but will happen upon the time before us," Scrooge pursued. "Is that so, spirit?" The upper portion of the garment was contracted for an instant in its folds, as if the spirit had inclined its head. That was the only answer he received. Although well used to ghostly company by this time, Scrooge feared the silent shape, so much that his legs trembled beneath him, and he found that he could hardly stand when he prepared to follow it. The spirit paused a moment, as observing his condition and giving him time to recover. But Scrooge was all the worse for this. It thrilled him with a vague, uncertain horror to know that behind the dusky shroud there were ghostly eyes intently fixed upon him, while he, though he stretched his own to the utmost, could see nothing but a spectral hand and one great heap of black. "Ghost of the future," he exclaimed, "I fear you more than any spectre I have seen. But I know your purpose is to do me good, and as I hope to live to be another man from what I was, I am prepared to bear your company, and do it with a thankful heart. Will you not speak to me?" It gave no reply. The hand was pointed straight before them. "Lead on," said Scrooge, "lead on. The night is waning fast, and it's precious time to me, I know. Lead on, spirit." The phantom moved away as it had come towards him. Scrooge followed in the shadow of its dress, which bore him up, he thought, and carried him along. They scarcely seemed to enter the city, but rather the city seemed to spring up about them and encompass them on its own act. But there they were in the heart of it, on 'change amongst the merchants, who hurried up and down and chinked the money in their pockets, and conversed in groups, and looked at their watches, and trifled thoughtfully with their great gold seals and so forth, as Scrooge had seen them often. The spirit stopped beside one little knot of businessmen. Observing that the hand was pointed to them, Scrooge advanced to listen to their talk. "No," said the great fat man with a monstrous chin, "I don't know much about it either way. I only know he's dead." "When did he die?" inquired another. "Last night, I believe." "Why, what was the matter with him?" asked a third, taking a vast quantity of snuff out of a very large snuff-box. "I thought he'd never die." "God knows," said the first with a yawn. "What has he done with his money?" asked the red-faced gentleman, with a pendulous excrescence on the end of his nose that shook like gills of a turkey-cock. "I haven't heard," said the man with the large chin, yawning again. "Left it to his company, perhaps. He hasn't left it to me, that's all I know." This pleasantry was received with a general laugh. "It's likely to be a very cheap funeral," said the same speaker, "for upon my life I don't know of anybody that's going to it. Suppose we make up a party and volunteer." "I don't mind going if a lunch is provided," observed the gentleman with the extra sense on his nose. "But if I must be fed, I'll make one." Another laugh. "Well, I'm the most disinterested among you all, after all," said the first speaker, "for I never wear black gloves, and I never eat lunch, but I'll offer to go if everyone else will. When I come to think of it, I'm not at all sure that I wasn't his most particular friend, for we used to stop and speak whenever we met. Bye-bye." Speakers and listeners strolled away and mixed with other groups. Scrooge knew the men, and looked towards the spirit for an explanation. The phantom glided onto a street. Its finger pointed to two persons meeting. Scrooge listened again, thinking that the explanation might lie here. He knew these men also, perfectly. They were the men of business, very wealthy, and of great importance. He had made a point of always standing well in their esteem, in a business point of view. This is, strictly business point of view. "How are you?" said another. "How are you?" returned the other. "Well," said the first, "Old Scratch has got his own at last, hey?" "So I'm told," returned the second. "Cold, isn't it?" "Seasonable for Christmas time. You're not a skater, I suppose?" "No, no. Something else to think of. Good morning." Not another word. That was their meeting, their conversation, and their parting. Scrooge was at first inclined to be surprised that the spirit should attach importance to the conversations apparently so trivial, but feeling assured that they must have some hidden purpose, he set himself to consider what they were likely to be. They could scarcely be supposed to have any bearing on the death of Jacob, his old partner, for that was past, and the ghost's province was the future. Nor could he think of anyone immediately connected with himself to whom he could apply them, but nothing doubting that to whomever some they applied, they had some latent moral for his own improvement. He resolved to treasure upon every word he heard, and everything he saw, and especially to observe the shadow of himself when it appeared, for he had an expectation that the conduct of his future self would give him the clue he missed, and he would render the solution of these riddles easily. He looked about that very place for his own image, but another man stood in his accustomed corner, and though the clock pointed to its usual time of day for being there, he saw no likeness of himself among the multitudes that poured through the porch. It gave him a little surprise, however, for he had been revolving in his mind a change of life. He thought and hoped he saw his new-born resolutions carried out in this. Quiet and dark beside him stood the phantom, with his outstretched hand. When he roused himself from his thoughtful quest, he fancied upon the turn of the hand and its situation in reference to himself, that the unseen eyes were looking at him keenly. It made him shudder and feel very cold. They left the busy scene and went to an obscure part of town, where and its bad repute, the ways were foul and narrow, the shops and houses wretched, the people half naked, drunken, slipshod, ugly. Alleys and archways, like many cesspools, disgorged their offences of smell and dirt and life upon the straggling streets, and the whole quarter reeked with crime, with filth and misery. Far in this den of infamous resort, there was a low, broad, beating shop below a penthouse roof, where iron, old rags, bottles, bones, and greasy offal were bought. Upon the floor were piled up heaps of rusty keys, nails, chains, hinges, files, scales, weights, and refuse iron of all kinds. Secrets that few would like to scrutinize were bred and hidden in mountains of unseemly rags, masses of corrupted fat, and set plurches of bones. Sitting in among the wares he dealt in, by charcoal stove made of old bricks, was a grey-haired rascal, nearly 70 years of age, who had screened himself from the cold air without by a frowsy curtaining of miscellaneous tatters, hung upon a line, and smoked his pipe in all the luxury of calm retirement. Scrooge and the phantom came into the presence of this man, just as a woman with a heavy bundle slunk into the shop. But she had scarcely entered when another woman, similarly laden, came in too, and she was closely followed by a man in faded black, who was no less startled by the sight of them than they had been upon the recognition of each other. After a short period of blank astonishment, in which the old man with the pipe had joined them, they all three burst into a laugh. "Let the chairwoman alone be to the first," cried she who had entered first. "Let the laundress alone be the second, and let the undertaker man alone be the third. Look here, old Joe, here's a chance. If we hadn't all three met here without meaning it." "You couldn't have met in a better place," said old Joe, removing his pipe from his mouth. "Come into the parlour. You were made free of it long ago, you know, and the other two aren't strangers. Stop till I shut up the door of the shop. Oh, how it shrieks! There ain't such a rusty bit of metal in the place as its own hinges, I believe, and I'm sure there's no such old bones here as mine. Ha ha! We're all suitable to our calling. We're all well matched. Come into the parlour, come into the parlour." The parlour was the space behind the screen of rags. The old man raked the fire together with an old stair rod, and having trimmed his smoky lamp, for it was night, with the stem of his pipe, put it in his mouth again. While he did this, the woman who had already spoken threw her bundle on the floor, and sat down in a flaunting manner on a stool, crossing her elbows on her knees, and looking with bold defiance at the other two. "What odds, then? What odds, Miss Dibbler?" said the woman. "Every person has the right to take care of themselves. He always did." "That's true indeed," said the laundress. "No man wore so. Why, then?" "Don't stand staring as if you were afraid. Woman, who's the wiser? We're not going to pick holes in each other's coats, I suppose." "No, indeed," said Mrs. Dibbler and the man together. "We should hope not." Very well then, cried the woman, that's enough. Who's the worse for loss of a few things like these? Not a dead man, I suppose. No, indeed, said Mrs. Dibbler, laughing. If he wanted to keep him after he was dead, a wicked old screw, pursued the woman, why wasn't he natural in his lifetime? If he had been, he'd have had somebody to look after him when he was struck with death, instead of lying gasping out his last breath alone by himself. It's the truest word that was ever spoken, said Mrs. Dibbler. It's a judgment on him. I wish it was a little heavier judgment, replied the woman, and it should have been. You may depend upon it. If I could have laid my hands on anything else, open that bundle, old Joe, and let me know what the value of it. Speak out plain. I'm not afraid to be the first, nor afraid for them to see it. We know pretty well that we were helping ourselves before we met here. I believe it. It's no sin. Open the bundle, Joe. But the gallantry of her friends would not allow this, and the man in faded black, mounting on the breech, first produced his plunder. It was not extensive. A seal or two, a pencil case, a pair of sleeve buttons, and a brooch of no great value were all there. They were severely examined and appraised by old Joe, who chalked up the sums he was disposed to give to each upon the wall, and added them up in total when he found there was nothing more to come. That's your account, said Joe, and I wouldn't give another sixpence if it was to be boiled for nothing for doing it. Who's next? Mrs. Dibbler was next. Sheets and towels, a little wearing apparel, 2 old-fashioned silver teaspoons, a pair of sugar tongs, and a few boots. Her account was stated on the wall in the same manner. I always give too much to ladies. It's a weakness of mine, and that's the way I ruin myself, said old Joe. That's your account. If you ask me for another penny, and I'll make it an open question, I'll repent of being so liberal, and knock off half a crown. And now undo my bundle, Joe, said the first woman. Joe went down on his knees for the greater convenience of opening it, and having unfastened a great many knots, dragged out a large and heavy roll of some dark stuff. What do you call this? Said Joe. Bed curtains. Ah, returned the woman, laughing and leaning forward on her crossed arms. Bed curtains. You don't mean to say you took 'em down, rings and all, with him lying there, said Joe. Yes, I do, replied the woman. Why not? You were born to make your fortune, said Joe, and you certainly do it. I certainly shan't hold my hand when I can get anything in it by reaching out, for the sake of such a man as he was. I promise you, Joe, returned the woman coolly. Don't drop that oil upon those blankets now. His blankets? Asked Joe. Whose else's, do you think? Replied the woman. He isn't likely to take the cold without them, I dare say. I hope he didn't die of anything catching, eh? Said old Joe, stopping in his work and looking up. Don't be afraid of that, returned the woman. I ain't so fond of his company that I'd loiter about him for such things, if he did. Oh, you may look through that shirt till your eyes ache, but you won't find a hole in it, nor a threadbare place. It's the best he had, a fine one too. They'll have wasted it if it hadn't been for me. What do you call wasting of it? Asked Joe. Putting it on him to be buried in, to be sure, replied the woman, with a laugh. Somebody was fool enough to do it, but I took it off again. If calico ain't good enough for such a purpose, it isn't good enough for anything. It's quite as becoming as to the body. He can't look uglier than he did in that one. Scrooge listened to this dialogue in horror, as they sat grouped about their spoil in the scanty light afforded by the old man's lamp. He viewed them with detestation and disgust, which could hardly be greater, though they had been obscene demons marketing the corpse itself. Ha! Laughed the same woman, when Joe produced a flannel bag with money in it, told out their several gains upon the ground. This was the end of it, you see. He frightened everyone away from him when he was alive to profit us when he was dead. Ha, ha, ha. Spirit, said Scrooge, shuddering from head to foot. I see, the case of this unhappy man might be my own. My life tends that way now. Merciful heaven, what is this? He recoiled in terror, for the scene had changed, and now he almost touched a bed, a bare, uncurtained bed, on which beneath a ragged sheet there lay something covered up, which, though it was dumb, announced itself in an awful language. The room was very dark, too dark to be observed with any accuracy, though Scrooge glanced around it, in obedience to a secret impulse, anxious to know what kind of room it was. A pale light rising in the outer air fell straight upon his bed, and on it, plundered and bereft, unwatched, unwept, uncared for, was the body of this man. Scrooge glanced towards the phantom. Its steady hand was pointed to the head. The cover was so carelessly adjusted that the slightest raising of it, the motion of a finger upon Scrooge's part, would have disclosed the face. He thought of it, felt how easy it would be to do, and longed to do it, but had no more power to withdraw the veil than to dismiss the spectre at his side. Oh, cold, cold, rigid, dreadful death, set upon thine altar here, and dress it with such terrors as thou hast any command. For this is thy dominion. But of all the loved, reved, and honoured head, thou canst not turn one hair to thy dreaded purposes, or make one feature odious. It is not that the hand is heavy and will fall down when released. It is not that the heart and pulse are still, but that the hand was open, generous and true, thy heart brave, warm, and tender, and thy pulse man's shadow strike, and see his good deeds springing up from the wound, to sow the world with life immortal. No voice pronounced these words in Scrooge's ears, and yet he heard them when he looked upon the bed. He thought of this man, could be raised up now, what would be in his foremost thoughts? Avarice, hard dealing, gripping cares, they had brought him to a rich end truly. He lay in the dark empty house with not a man, a woman, a child to say that he was kind to me in this or that, and for the memory of one kind word I will be kind to him. A cat was tearing at the door, and there was a sound of gnawing rats beneath the hearthstone, when they wanted in the room of death, and why they were so restless and disturbed. Scrooge did not dare think. Spirit, he said, this is a fearful place. In leaving it, I shall not leave its lesson. Trust me, let's go. Still the ghost pointed with an unmoved finger to the head. I understand you, Scrooge returned, and I would do it if I could, but I have not the power, Spirit. I have not the power. Again it seemed to look upon him. If there's any person in this town who feels emotion caused by this man's death, said Scrooge, quite agonized, show that person to me, Spirit, I beseech you. The phantom spread its dark robe before him for a moment, like a wing, and withdrawing it, revealed a room by daylight, where a mother and her children were. She was expecting someone, and with anxious eagerness, for she walked up and down the room, started at every sound, looked out from the window, glanced at the clocks, tried but in vain to work with her needle, and could hardly bear the voices of the children at their play. At length, the long-expected knock was heard. She hurried to the door, met her husband, a man whose face was careworn and depressed, though he was young. There was a remarkable expression in it now, a kind of serious delight of which he felt ashamed, and which he struggled to repress. He sat down to the dinner that had been hoarding for him by the fire, and when she asked him faintly, what news, which was not until after a long silence, he appeared embarrassed now to answer. Is it good, she said, or bad, to help him? Bad, he answered. We are quite ruined. No, there is hope yet, Caroline. If he relents, she said, amazed, there is. Nothing is past hope if such a miracle has happened. He is past relenting, said her husband. He is dead. She was a mild and patient creature, if her face spoke truth, but she was thankful in her soul to hear it, and she said so with clasped hands. She prayed for forgiveness the next moment, and was sorry, but the first was the emotion of her heart. What the half-drunken woman who I told you of last night said to me when I tried to see him and obtain a week's delay, and what I thought was a mere excuse to avoid me, turns out to be quite true. He was not only very ill, but dying then. To whom will our debt be transferred? I don't know, but before that time we shall be ready with the money, and even though we were not, it would be a bad fortune indeed to find a merciless creditor in his successor. We may sleep tonight with light hearts, Caroline. Yes, soften it as they would, their hearts were lighter. The children's faces, hushed and clustered around to hear what they so little understood, were brighter, and it was a happier house for this man's death. The only emotion that the ghost could show him, caused by the event, was one of pleasure. Let me see some tenderness connected to his death, said Scrooge, or that dark chamber spirit, which we left just now, will be for ever present to me. The ghost conducted him through several streets familiar to his feet, and as they went along, Scrooge looked here and there to find himself, but nowhere he was to be seen. They entered poor Bob Cratchit's house, the dwelling he had visited before, and found the mother and the children seated around the fire. Quiet, very quiet. The noisy little Cratchits were as still as statues in one corner, and they sat looking at Peter, who had a book before him. The mother and daughters were engaged in sewing, but surely they were very quiet, and he took a child and set them in the midst of them. Where had Scrooge heard these words? He had not dreamed them. The boy must have read them out as he and the spirit crossed the threshold. Why did he not go on? The mother laid her work upon the table, and put her hand up to her face. The colour hurts my eyes, she said. The colour. Oh, poor Tiny Tim. They are better now again, said Cratchit's wife. It makes them weak by candlelight, and I wouldn't show my weak eyes to your father when he comes home. For the world, it must be near his time. Psst, it rather, Peter answered, shutting up his book. But I think he has walked a little slower than he used to, these few last evenings, mother. They were then quiet again. At last she said in a steady, cheerful voice that only faltered once, I have known him walk with Tiny Tim upon his shoulder, very fast indeed. And so have I, cried Peter, often. And so have I, exclaimed another. So had all. But he was very light to carry, she resumed, intent upon her work. And his father loved him so. And that was no trouble he was. And there is your father at the door. She hurried out to meet him, and little Bob in his comforter, he had need of it, poor fellow, came in. His tea was ready for him on the hob, and they all tried who should help him to it most. The two young Cratchits got up upon his knees and laid each child a cheek against his face, as if they said, Don't mind it, father, don't be grieved. Bob was very cheerful with them, and spoke pleasantly to all his family. He looked up at the work upon the table, and praised the industry and speed of Mrs. Cratchit and the girls. They would be done long before Sunday, he said. Sunday. You went today, then, Robert, said his wife. Yes, my dear, returned Bob. I wish you could have gone. It would have done you good to see how green a place is. But you'll see it often. I promised him that I would walk there on Sunday. My little child, cried Bob. My little child. He broke down all at once. He couldn't help it. If he could have helped it, he would, and his child would have been farther apart perhaps than they were there. He left the room and went upstairs into a room above, which was lighted cheerfully and hung with the Christmas. There was a chair set close beside the child, and there were signs of someone having been there lately. Poor Bob sat down in it, and when he had thought a little and composed himself, he kissed the little face. He was reconciled to what had happened, and went down again quite happy. They drew about the fire and talked of the girls and mother's working still. Bob told them of the extraordinary kindness of Mr. Scrooge's nephew, whom he had scarcely seen but once, and who, meeting him in the street that day, and seeing that he looked just a little down, said Bob, inquired what had happened to distress him. On which, said Bob, for as the pleasant-spokenest gentleman you ever heard, I told him, I'm heartily sorry for it, Mr. Cratchit, he said, and heartily sorry for your good wife. By the by, how ever knew that I didn't know. Knew what, my dear? Why, that you were a good wife, replied Bob. Everyone knows that, said Peter. Very well observed, my boy, cried Bob. I hope they do. Heartily sorry, he said, for your good wife. If I can be of any service to you in any way, he said, giving me his card. That's where I live. Pray come to me. Now it wasn't, cried Bob, for the sake of anything he might be able to do for us, so much as for this kind way, that it was quite delightful. It really seemed as if he'd known our Tiny Tim, and felt with us. I'm sure he is a good soul, said Mr. Cratchit. You would have been sure of it, my dear, returned Bob, if you saw and spoke to him. I shouldn't be at all surprised, mark what I say, if he got Peter a better situation. Oh, hear that, Peter, said Mrs. Cratchit. And then, cried one of the girls, Peter will be keeping company with someone and setting up for himself. Get along with you, retorted Peter, grinning. It's just as likely as not, said Bob. One of these days, though there's plenty of time for that, my dear. But however and whenever we part from one another, I'm sure we shall none of us forget poor Tiny Tim, shall we, or this first parting that there were among us. Never, father, cried all. Okay, I'm going to stop there today. Hope you're enjoying the story so far. Lovely to have you with me, and take care of yourself today, and I'll be back for more story on Wednesday. Look forward to seeing you soon. Take care. Bye.